March 1979, La Jolla, California. A horrific sight greets two young boys as they arrive home from school to meet their mother, Barbara Becker.
Two sons, aged 7 and 9, found Barbara's body in the living room, surrounded by blood.
Barbara has been viciously assaulted.
Her throat had been slit, she had been beaten, there was quite a bit of blood.
There was blood throughout the house, blood in the sink, and there's blood in the toilet as well.
As the case progresses, detectives examine every possible avenue of inquiry.
A block and a half in every direction. We contacted every single resident.
The killing of Barbara was brutal and evil, but also senseless.
Eventually, the case goes cold.
It was really a crime with no witnesses. We had no motive, no evidence that would reveal the identity.
This is the story of the murder of Barbara Becker, the circumstances surrounding her murder, and how police commitment and the revolutionary new science of familial DNA profiling eventually led the bloodline detectives to uncover her murderer.
Genealogy is the most important tool we have right now in law enforcement, blowing up the doors on so many cases. It's exciting.
As two young boys returning from school at lunchtime opened the door of their house on the afternoon of Wednesday, March the 21st, 1979, what greeted them was a horrific sight.
Barbara's two sons, aged 7 and 9, had come home from school and found Barbara's body in the living room.
They normally came in through a side garage door, and they went to that door and went to go in, and the doors were locked. That was unusual. But their mother's car was there in the garage, a Volvo station wagon. So they went around to the front door, and it was unlocked. They went through it and immediately saw their mother immediately to their left, totally saturated in blood, deceased on the carpet.
They had only gone a few feet into the house, and I don't know how much they realized what had gone on at the time. I don't know how much they understood that she had been killed.
So they ran to a next door neighbor's house for help.
The neighbors immediately raised the alarm.
The call came from a neighbor of the victim. The initial response would be by San Diego PD patrol officers from Northern Division.
They get there, and their job is primarily to secure the scene, to make sure nobody leaves, no evidence walks away, nobody tampers with the scene.
When police arrived at the house at the intersection of Glenwick Lane and Bordeaux Avenue in the northern suburbs of La Jolla, they began to try and establish just what had happened.
Of course, in their case, it was obvious it was a murder. Then they would secure the scene, and they would call out the homicide team who would respond and assume the investigation.
They'll assign duties. Somebody will be responsible for the crime scene and the evidence there. Somebody will be responsible for interviewing witnesses, and the responsibilities get divvied up from there to a number of detectives.
We received a briefing from the patrol sergeant that was there. They'd gone through the front door. It was not locked. A neighbor adult had been in the house to observe the body the two boys had reported, and they'd left. We were a 4-person homicide team, and we entered the house and did what we call a walkthrough, where you walk in and single file observe the crime scene. So if you do any interviews, have any witnesses, you have an idea of exactly what you saw.
The scene was a single detached house on a corner. The house was neat and well kept. There were only a few areas of disturbance. Of course, one of the areas was near Barbara's body. But it appeared
there was a struggle. There was a table overturned, some table legs were broken off, things were moved about in the house.
And then also there was a television that was on the floor, which did not look like it belonged there. The body of Barbara was found on the floor, the carpet in the living room. Barbara had obviously fought hard for her life. There was a large pool of blood next to her.
Obviously, it was a terrible act of violence. What led to this act? Was it a burglary? Somebody interrupted him in the home? Was it a sexual assault that turned into a murder? Or was it somebody murdering for the sake of committing murder?
Usually when the throat's cut, then the person's on the floor. Then the blood comes out, pools out, but it's not unusual. At a stabbing scene, there's a lot of blood.
Well, it was shocking in that it was so violent.
From the scene, the homicide detectives were able to tell how the attack had likely unfolded.
All her clothing was intact. There was no obvious sexual event at all that appeared to occur. From an investigator's standpoint, it looked like the suspect went into actual killing frenzy. He just went berserk once she resisted. I assume he attacked her as she was defending herself, and that's when he stabbed her in the head. She was probably backing up, and it looks like he trapped her right in the corner of the room, and that's where he slit her throat.
I believe that whoever did this murder wanted to make sure she was dead, and that was his final blow.
Unusually, the killer had left the murder weapon at the scene.
The murder weapon was a knife that was found by the sofa.
I don't know that you'd say it was drenched in blood. It was about 10 feet from her body, and if you walked away from where her body was located towards the back of the house, it was dropped on the carpet right at the end of a couch in the same room her body was. And it had blood on the handle and on the blade.
Police did a thorough forensic search of the house and of the surrounding area.
Barbara had fought hard, but in a small area of the house. But then throughout other areas of the house, there was a blood trail, which obviously could not have been made by Barbara.
There was a blood trail that went from the vicinity of the body through the room into a kitchen that was on the left as you go out of the living room. In the kitchen, there was blood everywhere, very heavy bleeding. It appeared they had injured their own hands or some injury to their body, and it appeared to be the suspect's blood trail we were following through the house. It appeared that he did his first cleanup in the kitchen and went from there down the hall into a bathroom so he wouldn't be bleeding when he left the house. But he left a good trail of blood. We took a lot of bloody fingerprints, and in the toilet were toilet paper and napkins that were all bloody.
Took bloody towels that appeared to have perhaps the suspect's blood on them. They took swabs of the blood stains in the kitchen, in the bathroom, in the hallway. They took items that had been moved by the suspect. There was a small TV near Mrs. Becker's body. Primarily what they're doing in 1979 is they're not taking them for DNA purposes. They're taking them to fingerprint, they're taking them to blood type, they're looking for hair and fiber evidence. If there's a fiber they find, they can maybe match it to the suspect's carpet at his house, something like that. If there's a hair they find, they can maybe match it to the suspect's hair, that sort of thing.
The investigators from the coroner's office removed the body from the crime scene for an autopsy.
The coroner arrives at the request of the homicide unit after they've done their initial assessment of the scene, and the coroner would take custody of the body in possession. They would transport that body to the coroner's office.
They preserved the body, preserved the evidence on the body, bag the hands, because sometimes people fight and get fibers, things like that on the hands of the victims. Bag the body and take it back and do an autopsy a day or two later.
After they complete the investigation of the scene and all evidence is collected, that investigator goes to the county mortuary to do an investigation and photograph the body and injuries and look for any trace evidence.
A major murder investigation was launched with a dedicated team organized to track down the killer.
There's also wondering how safe the neighborhood's going to be after a crime like that.
It's always that concern, is that there's a serial killer on the loose.
In 1979, police in the northern San Diego suburban area of La Jolla were involved in a massive murder hunt to try and establish who had murdered 37-year-old Barbara Becker. Her two young sons had discovered Barbara's body as they arrived home from school at around 1:30 on Wednesday, the 21st of March. So who was Barbara, and why would anyone want to kill her?
Barbara Becker was a 37-year-old housewife. She was married to a doctor that worked at the Veterans Hospital nearby. She had two young sons, 9 years old and 7 years old. She was an upstanding member of the community. She played on a local football team with other women at the hospital, and there was nothing in her past that would suggest that she would be brutally murdered.
She was active in the community. She was a stay-at-home mom, but she was very active out and about when the kids were at school. She was a soccer mom, and she was involved in some other things in the community. Very well liked, no enemies to speak of.
When you have a crime like this that occurs in the home, initially you think, well, it could be a burglary. It could be somebody breaking in for a sex assault. It could be somebody coming over to settle a score. And so the detectives would have tracked down and investigated all of those avenues of investigation with Mrs. Becker to see where the investigation takes them.
At the time of this murder in 1979, our homicide team, we had one of the highest solve rates, meaning we solved them by arrest in the entire United States. But we followed basically the 48-hour rule to begin with. You always worked nothing else but that for a minimum 48 hours. And the most of that was around the clock, because the faster you can work it while information is newest, you can find witnesses that otherwise you may not find, or you can find suspects before they flee the area many times.
I think the culture of the police department has always been that they emphasize these type of investigations, and even when they're short on resources, they put everything they have into the murder cases. Going way back as far as I've been on the department, they've always taken the cases very seriously.
We were so procedural, we always operated with one sergeant as a supervisor and 3 detectives. And we all had assigned jobs. We would get together on a daily basis and crosstalk, meaning what have you done, what have you found out every day. As the investigation went on, we'd compare notes so everybody knew where the investigation was going and what was new or not. And we'd say, hey, what about this, what about that, and compare notes and move on. So our organization that we followed in San Diego with the dedicated homicide teams was very effective.
So what was the investigators' first thoughts on the profile of the killer?
It appeared to me to be a male because it was so overwhelming, obviously, from the attack. The type of person I would only venture to guess could have been a burglar with intent to steal out of the house, or it could have been sexual assault.
It would have to be somebody that could overcome Mrs. Becker's resistance. She was not an old woman by any means. She was 37 years old. It seems like she put up a fight. So somebody would have to overcome her resistance. It would have to be somebody that was cold-hearted to kill a woman in her house when probably a threat would have sufficed for whatever they were in there to do.
Police concentrated at first on those closest to her, her family.
Most murders are committed by people the victim knows, so they would go to family members. They would have gone to the husband.
When someone is killed like this, the significant other is a suspect. Many crimes are motivated for domestic reasons, domestic disputes. So that's something that has to be looked at regardless of whether it ultimately turns out to be true or false. It's one of the first steps that they would have taken.
Her husband was a physician at the Veterans Administration Hospital, which is only about a 7 to 10 minute drive from their house. And the house was in a very upscale neighborhood, and he was the head of a department at the hospital. We were aware that he was at work when he was notified, and he rushed home, and that's when I interviewed him. I asked him where he was, And he said he was at work. And I asked when he'd left the house. And he said he thought it was about 8:20 because he gave one of his sons a ride to school that day. Most of the time his boys would ride bicycles to school. So he dropped his son off at school and went to work and was there all day. We later interviewed fellow employees and determined he was there all day.
You would definitely want to find out if there was any marital discord, any problems in the marriage.
Had to get personal with him and ask him if he or his wife were having any known sexual relationships with anybody else besides themselves. We could not find any evidence of that, so we ruled out a jealousy of a relationship outside the marriage. So it appeared to us, after I'd interviewed him, that he was totally devastated, and his emotional reaction was normal of a family member that had just lost one of their spouses. He was distraught.
So the lead, if it was the lead, the investigation into the significant other, the spouse, quickly showed that he had nothing to do with the crime.
The autopsy was carried out and the horrific details of the injuries she sustained were revealed.
We would consider there to be two scenes. The scene would be the crime scene number one, and then the second scene would be the autopsy that occurred the following day.
At the mortuary, they identified like 7 or 8 slashes, individual slashes to her throat. It was cut several times, very deep, all the way to the backbone. She had stab wounds up to the top and side of her head. The wounds that were on her head were all the way to the skull. She had defensive wounds on her hand, trying to fend off the attacker while she was being stabbed. Her fingers were cut almost all the way to the bone.
It's always an indication that she put her hands up to defend herself and that she wasn't going as a willing victim who was surprised.
The cause of death was basically bleeding out from multiple stab wounds, and then the manner of death was a homicide, which is death by the hands of another.
Eager to find out if the neighbors had seen or heard anything, officers carried out door-to-door inquiries.
It was an upscale neighborhood. It was very quiet. It was all residential. It was off the beaten path, which is another thing unusual. It wasn't by any main thoroughfares. Not a lot of foot traffic through the neighborhood. It was just a quiet, great place to live.
A crime of this sort would be rare in that area. Were you to have a murder in that neighborhood, it would probably be something stemming from a domestic dispute, not something like this.
A block and a half in every direction, the streets around her house, we contacted every single resident and asked them about anything they'd seen that day, unusual, anybody they'd never seen in the neighborhood, if they'd had any prowlers or anything of that nature. We never found anybody that had any information for us. We had some neighbors that said, oh, there's a woman that looks like she may have been a maid coming to a neighbor's house. We chased down, identified who the maid was, and that her husband drove her there, dropped her off when she worked there. We identified a gardening crew that had been there the day before the murder and trimmed hedges on her and her husband's property with 2 assistant workers working for him. He was totally cooperative. They were totally cooperative. Nothing unusual. But we continued the follow-up for weeks. We were working other cases, but every time we got a break, we'd go back up and try to contact somebody else. And we found no evidence of who our suspect might have been in all those interviews.
Detectives also began to concentrate on a number of items related to the crime scene.
I was asked to analyze the evidence, and I probably got involved with that evidence sometime after the crime scene had occurred. I was giving blood stains, clothing items, anything else that they collected to go ahead and process for either blood or hairs, fibers, whatever kind of trace evidence we might find that might be significant. My analysis pretty much focused on the blood stains, and so I would go ahead and type the blood stains that I thought were significant. I'd have to pick and choose based on the information from the crime scene. And then I would also go through all of the items and collect all the hair and any fibers that I thought were out of place, collect them, package them away, and in case they ever got a suspect, that evidence would be able to be compared later on. For me personally, I don't get worked up about what they have found or not found. I just try and get the evidence analyzed and try and give them as much information as I can give them. I suspected if we don't catch them quickly that they won't be caught for quite a while unless they commit another crime.
In 1979, a lot of the credit to solving murders goes to old-fashioned police work because the technology we have today did not exist in 1979.
The forensic team had undertaken a comprehensive samples trawl.
We had blood, we had trace evidence analysis, latent fingerprints, which was probably the most valuable evidence back then, and because DNA did not exist. So for this case here specifically, we were pretty well limited to trace evidence in the blood and the fingerprints.
Fingerprints were used to match people, but you would kind of have to have a potential suspect in mind before you could make that match.
The blood stains that I examined were the same as Barbara Becker's blood. I did an ABO grouping and something called PGM, which is phosphoglucomutase, which is kind of an enzyme that was common testing back in 1979, 1980.
Which is nothing like DNA of today. If you have the suspect, you can match the enzyme with what the evidence would be. But it was nothing like DNA where you can say 1 in a billion or whatever. It's close, but not a cigar, so to speak. That's the only technology we had at that time.
So, for example, I'm a type O positive, but about 40% of the population is an O positive. If the blood stain at a crime scene was a type A, I would be excluded as being the source of that blood. But if that type was a type O positive, I could be the source of that blood, but 40% of the population could be the source of that blood. So it wouldn't eliminate me, but it wouldn't very strongly link me to that blood either. So it was very primitive. You know, it was almost just like a screening tool to maybe eliminate some suspects, focus the attention of investigators if they were doing that testing on those people. But the tools were very primitive.
Despite the best efforts of investigators, within a couple of years the case had gone cold. Police now feared they'd never discover who had killed Barbara.
We tried to do everything to make sure we left no stone unturned, and that's why we would go back to the cases we hadn't solved and continue to work them. And that follow-up work, many times, it would be months and sometimes years later, we'd actually make arrests on them. I mean, the tenacity that you have to be a successful homicide investigator is part of the job, but you don't just do everything you can on a case and drop it, never come back to it if possible.
It was really a crime with no witnesses, no evidence at the time that would reveal the identity. We had no motive, and so the case went cold.
The family were keen to keep the investigation alive.
I left the San Diego Police Department in 1982, so this murder was in 1979. But the family and relatives called the homicide division about every 18 months to 2 years and stayed in touch with investigators asking, hey, is anything new?
Her brother wrote several letters to the police department inquiring as to the status of the case and whether or not it was still being actively investigated. I know that in talking to the husband, who mentioned his children, that they have never forgotten it and that they were always yearning for some kind of closure.
Her husband never called because it was still emotional for him, and it was other relatives, sisters or whatever, that would call. Over the years, he'd remarried and was moving on with his life with his sons. I worked quite a few different mystery cases, from young women to elderly females that were murdered. I always kept track of them in my mind. Some of them I kept my notes on after as far as copies, so I would never forget them. And after I'd left homicide, about every 6-8 months, I'd call a homicide division and ask them, hey, can you do any more on this to follow up, because I never want anybody to forget them.
In general, in cold case homicides, they're unsolved for a reason. So you have a murder case, there's been a lot of effort done at the time by the detectives and the police departments. Any logical lead has already been followed up on and investigated by the time a case comes cold. So at that point, you need something new, whether that's an advanced fingerprinting technique, whether you get a new witness or a confession by someone or an admission. Maybe sometimes it's just a fresh set of eyes to put the pieces together in a different fashion. But you need something to get past the wall, to get past the area where you've stalled on the case.
Our office and our unit was aware of this case for a number of years. It stood out because of the victim as being a very low risk, it being inside a house. It had a potential for physical evidence. So in 2003, the cold case team entered the DNA from the blood drops into CODIS, hoping for a match. At that time, we were getting a lot of hits in CODIS. Of course, that's the first time we really started aggressively using CODIS.
There's a DNA database in California that offenders go into. So when you commit a felony offense, your DNA is taken, it's added to the database. But people that were committing crimes in 1979, their DNA was not in any database. Their DNA sample was not taken because nobody knew about DNA at the time. When they compared the sample left at the scene, the unknown DNA profile from that blood, it didn't hit to anyone in the database. And so now you have a lead, you have a clue, you know who the person is, you just don't know who that DNA belongs to.
And what do? You're kind of done. If you can't get a hit in that database, you're back to square one.
It appeared there was no match for the samples found at the scene at Glenwick Lane all those years ago. Yet again, police had reached a dead end in the case of Barbara Becker, which looked like it would never be solved. By 2018, almost 40 years after her death, police in San Diego, California were no closer to solving the murder of La Jolla resident Barbara Becker. But investigators at the San Diego Police Department had become aware of a revolutionary new crime-fighting technology.
Genetic genealogy is using a different kind of DNA testing than is normally used in order to generate a profile that can be uploaded to publicly accessible DNA databases. Using death records, birth records, you can build a family tree and find where the suspect is.
We were working for quite a while with our cold case unit, and the work that we tended to do for them was a lot of work on a relatively small number of cases. And myself and another criminalist in the laboratory were discussing this, and we thought that there was a possibility that there was good DNA evidence in unsolved crimes that wasn't being worked because nobody knew that it existed. The cold case unit just didn't have the resources to do a systematic screening through unsolved cases looking for new evidence. They were spending their time working on the cases basically on their desk at the time. So we got permission from the laboratory management as well as the people in the homicide unit to go down and look through files from unsolved homicides. They had binders full of summaries of unsolved crimes. So what we do is we would go looking for cases that had good prospect of having perpetrator DNA. And I saw that this was a stabbing, which are the cases that I was looking at, hoping that the person might have cut themselves during the event. So I saw that it was a stabbing, it was unsolved, so I asked that case be pulled. It's disturbing, certainly. I try to keep a fairly level head about these things and focus on the information that I need to do to do my job the best that I can. There was obviously a lot of violence. It was a horrible way to die. I hoped it would be resolved once we got the testing done and put it in the database. All of the blood stains came back as male and the victim was female, and she was eliminated as the source of that blood. So this was very likely going to be perpetrator blood.
You upload the crime scene sample and you get a hit to maybe a second cousin, maybe a first cousin. But you don't know which side of the family it's on. You don't know where it is in the family tree. You have to build the family tree, identify all of the second cousins, and then start looking who looks more likely to be a suspect than not.
This was a very interesting case because when we entered the offender's DNA into these databases, and we can also find out approximately what the ancestry is of the offender, we found out that he's primarily from French Canada. So a lot of the databases that we use in the United States were not helpful to us because the people we're looking for and trying to build on are all in Canada. We took that DNA, we entered it into the database, and we found out that this person was closely related to another family called Chartrand. And then from that we were able to divine who the offender was, Paul Chartrand.
So why had Paul Chartrand killed Barbara Becker? Was he known to the Becker family at the time of Barbara's death? What was his motivation? What had happened that day? Was he a sexual deviant, and did he go in with the intention to kill?
When we did a background on Paul Chartrand, we found out that he was, in fact, in San Diego during the time of the crime. We found out that he had a business in La Jolla.
He actually was working for a carpet cleaning company, probably 3/4 of a mile from the house. It was on Ivanhoe Street in La Jolla.
We found out Chartrand was actually out on bail for another sexual assault case, although Barbara was not a sexual assault case. But he was out on bail, and he may have even been, according to his ex-wife, on the run during the time he committed the crime. The bail, I think, was surprisingly low for a offense of that nature. And all I can say is that, had he been in jail, Barbara would still be alive.
My guess is he went in either to rape or sexually assault the victim if he knew who was there, or he went in to burglarize the place and he was caught inside the house and he didn't want any witnesses and he went berserk before he went out and exited. So I can't second guess what he went in for.
When he came to the house that day and grabbed a knife from the kitchen, it was to subdue and ultimately kill Mrs. Becker. So from that sense, it's certainly an intentional act. It's not an accident. He cut her throat. This was something he meant to do. Now, whether he had that plan when he broke into the house or it developed when Mrs. Becker was there, we don't know. He had convictions for sexual crimes. Now, whether we can infer that was the reason he went into Mrs. Becker's house, it's certainly something that investigators would have to consider.
No one saw him, unfortunately. He would have had to have had a car to get in and out of that neighborhood because it's not around any other places. It's off the beaten path. Also, if he was going to steal anything from a house, he would probably have to have a car to transport it. So I would say the offender had a car, went there to do a burglary, and it went bad. I think he absolutely thought he'd never be caught. After he did his time, he moved to Arizona, and I figured he probably thought he got away with it. It was many, many years.
I don't have a clue what was going through his mind, but there's a lot of sick people in the world. To just kill somebody that violently and go on with their life. Well, I hate to say evil, but I would say that no remorse.
Nearly 40 years since the savage assault and murder of 37-year-old La Jolla resident Barbara Becker, investigators were getting close to a conclusion in the case. Despite trying to revive the investigation a number of times, it had taken years of patience and eventually the revolutionary new science of familial DNA profiling to get the break they needed. Police in San Diego now believe they were finally reaching a conclusion by identifying a man called Paul Jean Chartrand as the killer. But there was a problem.
He had been deceased since 1995. So how do you compare the DNA at that point?
His DNA was not immediately available to us. However, we found out that several of his sons were still living, and the mother of the son was living, conveniently enough, in Southern California.
Luckily, the suspect's family was cooperative, and they very much wanted to help in the investigation, and if they could help this other family that was grieving that had lost someone and didn't know the circumstances, they were willing to do that.
The son was very gracious to talk to us, very cooperative. And at one point when we told him the entire story, and I wanted to be honest with him and tell him that, this could mean your dad is a killer. And he said, I know he is. I can tell you right now. My dad was mean. And at one point when he was a kid, his dad picked him up and threw him through a wall. It made me upset that a kid could get treated like that, but it also made me even more convinced that Shatron was going to be our guy.
So they need to do a comparison using standard DNA from the suspect to the crime scene to see if it's the person that they're looking for, to see if it's the right suspect.
It was very satisfying when I saw the results of the DNA testing that I did on the son and wife of this person, because I saw that his types fit in perfectly with this paternity trio, essentially, that I had, and this identifying him as the perpetrator.
We were able to prove conclusively, using standard CODIS markers, STR markers, that Paul Shatron was the offender.
The suspect was indeed Barbara Becker's killer.
When we were getting close, I reached out to Barbara's husband, who's living in Chicago, and I told him that we were close and I felt that we were probably going to solve the case. And so I wanted to let him know first, so he was the first person I called. I told him basically that the person we were looked at was confirmed. I told him the story of how it happened. He said, thank you very much. He was very appreciative of it, and he in turn communicated with his sons and brother-in-law. He didn't cry. He's a pretty tough guy, and he's been living with this for 40 years, but I think there was a big feeling of relief on his part. I think he was also glad that he would not have to face a trial after all these years, that the offender was gone. Immediately after calling up Barbara's husband, I called the Shatron family, because obviously there would be a press release and that they would find out. I felt they should hear it from me. And they said, thank you very much for letting us know. They were very horrified that the person they knew would be involved in something like this. They're very nice people. The whole family's very nice people. I think that was a secret that he kind of kept from his family and from everyone around him.
It was the case at the top of my list of cases that I was hoping to be solved, and I knew it was, just a tragedy, and we deal with tragedies every day, but this was one that I always hoped would be resolved, and obviously glad it did.
The resolutions for me on most all these cases are where the big moment is, when we've solved the crime. The detectives have found out who the suspect is. We've actually helped them link the suspect. That's the neat stuff about being in a crime lab.
For a short period of time, there's been a lot of media interest after the fact because of the way it was solved with genealogy and because of the nature of the crime and how old it is. The chief was very, very happy about this particular case. There's a lot of retired detectives and some retired DAs that were familiar with the case that had been following it over the years, and I think they were all real happy that it finally got solved. They were really surprised at the answer, because this guy was not in the original book. Nobody had ever talked to him. He'd never been considered as a suspect. He was just kind of out of the blue.
It was very pleasing to me to realize that we had collected the evidence, preserved everything, and documented enough to be able to lead to a final resolution for the relatives in solving the case.
I think we've closed the case for them as much as it can be closed. Obviously, there's a million questions we'd like to ask the offender. I'd love to sit across from him and ask him why. It's always easy to look at the answers in the back of the book once you finish the book. At the time, of course, I'm sure they probably thought it was a burglary gone bad. With all the information we have now, I still think it was something like that, but I think that it can't be coincidence that the killer worked at a upholstery cleaning spot near where the victim lived. There's got to be some kind of connection there, but unfortunately we'll probably never know. Barbara Becker was a woman who was going about her life, a good person, and just through a evil happenstance ran into the wrong person and was killed.
She seemed like a normal, everyday housewife, somebody that cared for her family, somebody that cared for her children. Certainly, this was like a bolt from the blue. She didn't expose herself to some sort of risk that put her in danger of being violently murdered. This murder found her for reasons maybe we'll never know.
The most difficult part was to realize that her two sons, the young men, had discovered their mother deceased, stabbed with her throat slit in their house when they came home. That's difficult. They'll be traumatized in some manner for the rest of their life because of that.
I mean, no child should ever have to go through that. It's horrific. I can't imagine what it must have been like. It had to have affected them over the years.
I would let them know that I'm sorry I couldn't bring their mom back.
I'm proud of the San Diego Police Department in that they've always placed a very high emphasis on murder investigations. They put a lot of resources into their cases. They put a lot of resources into their investigations. And I think they did everything they could do with what they had at the time.
I think they did a stellar job. The information that I found very clearly communicated to me what I needed to know. The crime scene diagram was very well done. I could see very quickly the information that I was looking for, which is, these blood stains throughout the house.
Using the techniques they had, they did a great job investigating this. The police department and the detectives were motivated to find the killer of this young woman and to give the family some solace. But they just didn't have enough tools in the toolbox. And even when DNA came by and using the blood at the scene, doing standard DNA testing, getting a great DNA profile from this crime scene, still, they didn't have the necessary database, the necessary profiles to match it to the suspect. It was only when genealogy came in that they were able to do that.
This case could not have been solved without genealogy. It would have gone unsolved. Genealogy is the most important tool we have right now in law enforcement to solve violent crime cases. Period, the end. The technique works. It's minimally invasive to anyone except the offender. It's a groundbreaker. It's just blown open the doors on so many cases. It's exciting.
Forensic genealogy is extremely important for crime investigations, and it's only going to become more so.
The previous thinking was that if you committed a crime of violent nature, you would continue to do that until you get caught. Now we're finding out there's a lot of people who do one bad thing, then they blend into society. They become your neighbor, they become your friend at the gym. You don't know who they are, and we're finding these people now, so it's kind of creepy.
The Barbara Becker case gives me hope. This was a tragedy many decades ago, and then that tragedy was compounded by the family not knowing who the suspect was, not seeing that suspect held accountable for their crime, not bringing closure to them, what closure criminal conviction and a sentence could. Knowing that we can reach back so far in time now and we can solve some of these murders that have been unsolved for so long gives me hope, and it makes me excited to think about what other cases we could crack, what other solutions, what other suspects we can catch, what's waiting for us around the next corner with genetic genealogy.
His blood basically was a signature. It was as good as a picture. It was as good as a confession, because it told the entire story of what happened, who did it, and eventually it told us his name.
It took a team to solve this case, but the fact that I was able to get the ball rolling and through the tremendous amount of effort by a lot of other people, it was able to be solved.
So even though sometimes the investigation will hit a dead end for years or even decades, there's always that next advance. There's always that next breakthrough that could be the one that solves the case.